most dangerous moment in a narcissistic relationship is not when you argue. It's not when you cry. It's not even when you threaten to leave. It's the moment you go quiet because silence tells them something terrifying. You see them now. In that instant, the relationship ends psychologically. You are no longer a partner, a supply, or a source of validation. You become evidence. And narcissists don't negotiate with evidence. They try to erase it. Let's strip the emotion out of this and look at the mechanics. A narcissist does not connect through intimacy. They connect through regulation, specifically emotional regulation through another human being. In behavioral terms, you were never the partner. You were the stabilizer, the regulator, the external nervous system. Every reaction you gave, confusion, anxiety, reassurance seeking, over-explaining, apologizing, was not accidental. It was harvested. That emotional output served a purpose. It allowed the narcissist to feel real, grounded, and powerful without having to self-regulate. This is why arguments never resolved anything. This is why clarity never worked. This is why logic always escalated the situation. You weren't failing at communication. You were participating in a closed-loop control system. Now here's the critical shift. The moment you figure them out, the system loses voltage. Not because you confront them, not because you threaten to leave, but because your emotional output drops below usable levels. This is what people misunderstand. Insight doesn't change narcissists. Emotional withdrawal destabilizes them. When you stop reacting in predictable ways, the feedback loop collapses. And collapse is the right word. From their perspective, something essential just died. You may still be physically present. You may still speak. You may even be polite. But your nervous system is no longer synchronized with theirs. That's the moment they know. Because narcissists don't read words. They read state changes. Your tone flattens. Your urgency disappears. Your eyes stop searching their face for cues. And this is not subtle to a narcissist. This feels like a sudden environmental failure, like oxygen being removed from a sealed room. They will test it immediately. They'll say something inflammatory. They'll imply abandonment. They'll manufacture guilt. Why? Because control is confirmed through emotional displacement. If they can move you emotionally, they still exist in your nervous system. But when the usual triggers produce nothing, no defense, no pleading, no emotional spike, they experience what psychologists call narcissistic destabilization. This is not sadness. This is not regret. This is threat perception. At a biological level, the narcissist's identity depends on external confirmation. When that confirmation disappears, the brain doesn't interpret it as the relationship is changing. It interprets it as, I am losing access to regulation. That's why silence is more dangerous than anger. Anger proves engagement. Silence proves autonomy, and autonomy is intolerable to a narcissist. This is where people get confused. They think the narcissist becomes aggressive because they're losing you. That's incorrect. They become aggressive because they're losing control over your internal state. In influence psychology, the most powerful position is not dominance. It's predictability. For years, they knew exactly which buttons to press to get emotional output. Now those buttons don't work. That's not rejection. That's system failure, and systems respond to failure with escalation. This is why the narcissist suddenly appears more volatile right after you gain clarity. They are trying to reboot the system. They will raise intensity. They will raise emotional stakes. They will introduce fear, urgency, or crisis. Because intensity is a shortcut to control. But here's the key insight most survivors miss. The narcissist doesn't experience this as you figured me out. They experience it as, my access has been cut. That distinction matters because it explains why explanations don't help, why reassurance doesn't calm them, why compassion doesn't land. They're not responding to meaning. They are responding to resource loss. Once you understand that, your confusion ends. You realize you didn't change too suddenly. You didn't become cold. You didn't give up. You stopped exporting emotional regulation. And the moment that export stops, the narcissist enters survival mode. This is why your calm feels threatening, why your neutrality feels hostile, why your grounded presence feels like rejection. You are no longer feeding the loop. And from a behavioral standpoint, that's the beginning of the end. Because narcissistic control does not collapse through confrontation. It collapses through non-participation. Not silence as a tactic, not distance as punishment, but internal disengagement. Once your nervous system exits the loop, the relationship has already ended, whether either of you admits it or not. And that is how a narcissist knows you've figured them out. Not because you said something, but because the power stopped flowing. Let's remove the mythology and talk about perception. Narcissists do not see people the way healthy individuals do. They don't experience relationships as mutual bonds. They experience them as positions in a hierarchy of control. For most of the relationship, your position was clear. You were emotionally engaged, uncertain, responsive. That made you predictable. Predictability equals safety. The moment you figure them out, that predictability disappears. And when predictability disappears, the narcissist stops relating and starts assessing. This is the moment survivors often describe as the stare. But this isn't mystical. It's diagnostic. You are watching a shift from relational processing to threat evaluation. In influence psychology, this is the moment someone switches from social mode to tactical mode. The face changes, the body stills, the eyes lock in, not with emotion but with calculation. Why? Because your perception has changed and they can see it. You're no longer scanning their face for approval. You're no longer trying to decode their mood. You're not emotionally tracking them. You're observing. That shift is devastating to a narcissist. Their entire false self depends on being experienced as powerful, desirable, or morally superior. When you stop emotionally participating in that illusion, they feel exposed. This is why survivors often say, "It felt like they knew I could see through them." That's accurate because narcissists are highly attuned to micro changes in attention. They had to be. Their survival depends on managing perception. And now your attention has changed direction. You're no longer focused on what they feel about you. You're focused on what they are. That's the moment the mask fails. From a psychological standpoint, being seen is not intimacy for a narcissist. It's annihilation. Healthy people feel known. Narcissists feel uncovered. So their nervous system reacts accordingly. They don't lean in. They don't explain. They don't repair. They scan. This is where the stare comes from. You are no longer being engaged as a person. You are being evaluated as a risk. Your calm becomes suspicious. Your neutrality becomes hostile. Your clarity becomes dangerous. Why? Because perception is power, and you now possess information they cannot control. This is why your eyes matter. For years, your eyes reflected uncertainty, hope, emotional dependence. That feedback told them the illusion was working. Now your eyes are steady, detached, non-reactive. That's not indifference. That's cognitive dominance. In interrogation psychology, the person who asks fewer questions and shows less emotional variance holds more power. Narcissists instinctively recognize this dynamic. They feel the balance shift. And here's the critical insight. The narcissist does not feel guilty in this moment. They feel vulnerable. Guilt requires empathy. Vulnerability triggers defense. That's why their expression hardens. The stare isn't anger, it's containment. They are trying to figure out, what do you know? How much do you know? Who else might know? What are you planning? Because narcissists assume malice where clarity exists. Why? Projection. They would weaponize insight if the roles were reversed, so they assume you will too. This is when the relatio and ship silently reclassifies. You are no longer my partner. You are someone with leverage, and leverage equals danger. This is why confrontation backfires at this stage. They're no longer listening for understanding. They're listening for threat indicators, tone, timing, confidence. Every word you say is evaluated for strategic intent. And if they sense certainty, real certainty, not bravado, their internal alarm escalates, because certainty cannot be gaslit. This is the turning point where many survivors feel the emotional temperature drop, not into sadness, but into coldness. That's not distance, that's depersonalization. Once you are perceived as a threat, empathy shuts down completely. The narcissist's brain narrows focus. Relationship goals disappear. Control and self-preservation take priority. This is why the stare feels so unsettling. You are watching someone revoke your humanity in real time, not because you harmed them, but because you saw them clearly. And clarity removes their camouflage. The mask was never for you. It was for themselves. It stabilized their identity by controlling perception. When your perception breaks free, the mask no longer functions. And without the mask, the narcissist is exposed. That exposure feels like danger. So the stare is not curiosity. It's reconnaissance. It's the moment they stop asking, how do I get supply? And start asking, how do I contain this? That's how a narcissist knows you figured them out. No. T because you said anything, but because you stopped seeing them and started seeing through them. When control begins to fail, narcissists don't stop manipulating. They accelerate. This phase is not emotional collapse. It's diagnostic behavior. Once the narcissist realizes you are no longer emotionally predictable, their primary question becomes very simple. What still works? Everything you witness next is an experiment. From a behavioral standpoint, this is called variable testing under threat. When a system loses reliable feedback, it cycles rapidly through previously successful inputs to locate any remaining leverage. This is not confusion. This is not desperation. This is pattern-driven survival behavior. You may see rage appear out of nowhere, then tears, then emotional withdrawal, then affection, then indifference, then sexual availability. Sometimes within minutes. Survivors often describe this as chaotic, but it's not random. It's systematic. Each emotional shift is a probe designed to measure your internal state. The narcissist is watching for micro-responses, a change in your breathing, a defensive explanation, a softening of tone, a reflex to reassure, a moment of guilt. Any reaction, positive or negative, is data, and data equals access. In influence psychology, control doesn't require compliance. It only requires engagement. As long as you are reacting, you are participating. That's why narcissists don't care how you respond, only that you do. This is why rage and victimhood often appear back to back. Rage tests fear. Victimhood tests empathy. Seduction tests attachment. Cold withdrawal tests abandonment, anxiety. Each tactic targets a different emotional access point. They are searching for residual conditioning, because even when insight has occurred, conditioning can remain. This is what makes this phase so dangerous. You may intellectually understand what's happening, but your nervous system has years of learned responses. The narcissist knows this. They rely on it. That's why the escalation feels theatrical. They are not trying to resolve anything. They are trying to provoke an involuntary response. This is what I call control scraping, dragging every behavioral tool across your psyche to see what still triggers movement. And here's the critical insight. When nothing works, something breaks. The narcissist's identity depends on being able to influence. When influence fails, their internal narrative collapses. They don't think, I've lost them. They think, I've lost my position. This triggers what's known as narcissistic injury, a profound threat to self-structure. That's when their behavior becomes more extreme, not because you hurt them, but because their tools failed. This is why you may see emotional whiplash intensify the calmer you become. Your neutrality isn't read as peace, it's read as resistance, and resistance must be overcome. From a tactical standpoint, this is where many survivors accidentally re-enter the system. They respond to tears. They defend against accusations. They explain intentions, and in doing so, they restore engagement. Even a calm explanation is a response. Even a boundary can be exploited if it's emotionally charged. The narcissist isn't listening to your words. They're monitoring state change. Do you stiffen? Do you soften? Do you hesitate? Those signals tell them where to push next. This is why the chaos stops only when one of two things happens. Either they regain control or they realize control is no longer possible. When every tactic fails, when rage, tears, seduction, and silence produce the same non-reactive response, the narcissist receives a message they cannot ignore. The conditioning is broken. At that point, the manipulation phase ends, not because they accept reality, but because they move to containment. This is the moment the relationship transitions from manipulation to damage control. You are no longer viewed as supply. You are viewed as liability, and liabilities are not negotiated with. They are neutralized. That's why this phase often precedes increased secrecy, projection, paranoia, smear campaigns, because once influence fails, reputation becomes the battlefield. But understand this, chaos mode is not proof of your failure. It is proof of your effectiveness. It only appears when control is threatened. If you were still under influence, there would be no need to escalate. The performance. CE exists because you are no longer playing your role. The most important takeaway here is this. The narcissist is not spiraling because they're losing you emotionally. They're spiraling because their behavioral leverage no longer works. And leverage, not love, was the foundation of the relationship. Once you see this phase clearly, it loses much of its power. You stop interpreting their behavior emotionally and start reading it strategically. And when you do that, their options collapse even faster because chaos requires participation. And you've already stepped out of the system. That's how a narcissist knows you figured them out, not because you confronted them, but because nothing they do can move you anymore. When manipulation fails, the narcissist strategy changes. They stop trying to control you and start trying to control the environment around you. This is not emotional escalation. This is containment. Once they realize they can no longer influence your internal state, they assume the next threat is exposure. And because narcissists operate through projection, they assume you will do exactly what they would do in your position. Destroy first. Control the narrative. Eliminate credibility. This is where paranoia enters. From a psychological standpoint, paranoia is not random suspicion. It's threat amplification. The narcissist's mind becomes hyper-focused on risk because their false self feels structurally unstable. They begin scanning for leaks. They hide phones, change passwords, move money, control conversations, take calls in isolation, not because you accuse them, not because you attack them, but because you know insight equals danger, and danger requires fortification. This is why survivors often describe this phase as living with someone who thinks they're under investigation. That description is accurate. The narcissist has reclassified the relationship as a battlefield. You are no longer a partner. You are an internal threat. From a behavioral perspective, this is classic resource protection behavior. When access to supply is threatened, narcissists prioritize information control, asset protection, reputation defense. The goal is not reconciliation. The goal is damage limitation. This is also where projection intensifies. Projection is not denial. It's displacement. When a narcissist accuses you of being manipulative, abusive, narcissistic, or unstable, they're not confused. They're executing a strategy. By assigning their traits to you, they accomplish three things. They confuse your internal narrative. They preempt external exposure. They regain psychological footing. This is why they often adopt therapeutic language during this phase. Words like gaslighting, empathy, abuse, and toxic suddenly appear in their vocabulary. This isn't growth, it's weaponization. They are attempting to scramble your signal. If they can get you questioning your own perception, if they can trap you in self-analysis, they slow your momentum, doubt buys them time. This is not about winning an argument. It's about destabilizing your certainty. And certainty is the most dangerous thing you can possess. Once projection fails to pull you back into confusion, the final stage begins. The smear campaign. This is not impulsive anger. It's preemptive narrative control. The narcissist understands something very clearly. Truth without credibility is powerless. So they move first. They speak to friends, family, colleagues, sometimes even therapists or authorities before you do. They present themselves as concerned, confused, wounded. They describe you as unstable, abusive, mentally unwell, or going through something. They plant context. That way, when you eventually speak, your words arrive pre-contaminated. This is not coincidence. It's strategy. In influence psychology, the first narrative establishes the frame. Everything that follows is filtered through it. They are not trying to prove you wrong. They are trying to make you unbelievable. And here's the hardest truth for survivors to accept. The smear campaign is confirmation. Healthy people don't launch reputation attacks when confronted with clarity. Only people protecting a false self do. The narcissist isn't trying to hurt you emotionally here. They're trying to isolate you. Isolation removes witnesses. Isolation removes validation. Isolation restores control. That's why they target your support system. They don't want to defeat you in private. They want to collapse your social structure. But understand this clearly. The smear campaign does not begin because you spoke. It begins because they believe you could. Your silence doesn't stop it. Your compliance doesn't stop it. Your empathy doesn't stop it. Only irrelevance does. Once the narcissist believes you no longer matter to the narrative, the campaign loses energy. But until then, their behavior will feel calculated and cold because it is. At this stage, emotion has left the equation. What remains is self-preservation. This is why the advice to just explain yourself is dangerous. Explanation feeds engagement. Engagement feeds relevance. Relevance feeds containment. The narcissist doesn't need to defeat your arguments. They just need to frame you. That's why your most powerful response is not defense. It's consistency. Consistency in behavior. Consistency in boundaries. Consistency in truth. Over time, patterns speak louder than accusations, and narcissists collapse under pattern exposure because lies require maintenance. Truth does not. So when you see paranoia, projection, and smear tactics appear together, do not doubt yourself. This is not escalation due to love lost. This is escalation due to control lost. You are watching a false structure defend itself against collapse. And the fact that it needs to defend itself at all means something important. You already won the psychological battle. They know you see them. And everything you're witnessing now is proof of that from a psychological perspective. Narcissism relies on external regulation. The narcissist cannot stabilize their identity internally. They require constant external feedback. When you figure them out, three things happen simultaneously. Supply disruption, emotional access is cut, identity threat. The false self feels exposed, control loss, manipulation stops working. This creates acute narcissistic injury, which triggers aggression, paranoia, projection, reputation control. Understanding this protects you from self-blame and confusion. Their escalate. Ion is not about love. It's about containment of truth. Here's what matters most. Their reaction is your validation. Healthy people don't collapse when they're understood. Only false selves do. You didn't destroy the relationship. You destroyed the illusion. What you're witnessing isn't strength. It's exposure panic. It's the rage of a structure that can't survive truth. So don't second guess yourself. Don't explain. Don't argue. Clarity is enough because once you see them clearly, they lose the only power they ever had. And that's where your freedom begins.